and welcome to Adelaide and Proctor Victorian Poetry, Faith and Fundraising. I'm Elizabeth Ludlow.
And I'm Amanda Vernon. Today, for our episode on feminism and print culture, we are joined by two guests. Alex Round, a real expert, as you'll hear, on Proctor's close friend Bessie Parks and on the feminist networks in which they were involved, and James Mussell, who is an expert on 19th century print cultures and who has a particular knowledge of the journal that Proctor was involved in producing. We are excited for you to hear both of these conversations.
My name is Alex Round. I have very recently come out of the other end of my PhD viva, which was, my thesis was titled Sisters in Art Reassessing the Pre-Raphaelite Sisterhood. I focused on women's friendships and ways in which these friendships informed their creative and political output, and in what ways were their works methods or forms of collaboration or examples of collaboration. That's pretty much me in a nutshell as a researcher. Aside from that, I'm a pre-Raphaelite enthusiast. I'm also an art and literary historian, and I'm affiliated with the Pre-Raphaelite Society. So, as I was just explaining to you guys earlier on, it's really nice to be on the other side of the podcast mic, really.
Brilliant, thank you. Just wondering when you first encountered Proctor.
When I was looking at my doctoral thesis, the main problem that I had was whittling it down to what women I was going to look at in particular, because as I'm sure you guys know, there's hundreds of them, like hundreds and hundreds of women who are overdue scholarly and public attention. The hardest thing about the whole process was trying to specify the scope of my actual research. I knew that my research wanted to feature Bessie Parks, but it was through Bessie Parks and her wealth of correspondence at Girton that I came across Proctor. And Proctor had a lot to do with Parks's political career, particularly with her involvement with English Woman's Journal. And I don't know, her name just kept on cropping up in correspondence, in between some of the women that I've been looking at. And I wanted to get her involved with the ideas that I was expressing within my thesis somehow, some way. But unfortunately, I was unable to make her one of the main features because of the fact that there was just so many of them. But I was pleased I was able to get her involved somehow.
I wonder if you can introduce for our listeners who Bessie Parks was and what she did, and perhaps her relationship with Proctor as well.
Well, first and foremost, Bessie Parks is an absolutely brilliant woman. I think I'm her biggest fan, to be honest. So she's a Brummie poet, which is kind of part of the reason why I love her so much, because she's a local lass like me. So she's a Brummie poet, and she was born in Temple Street, which is, right smack bang in the middle of the city centre. And she was brought up within the radical Unitarian circles there. So her father was quite a prominent member of the radical Unitarian circles, and he was very well connected. Her first ever recorded memory was being at one of the political rallies in the middle of Birmingham in the main square. Again, that says absolutely everything about her as a person, about her ambitions, about her politics. She became incredibly interested in women's education, women's right to an equally broad and thorough education as men, which again stemmed from her radical Unitarian upbringing. And that led her to becoming connected with so many other prominent women of the day, so like Barbara Bodichon, Adelaide Proctor, Anna Jameson, Mary Howitt, so many other women who are having the same conversations and are sharing the same beliefs. And she entwined this throughout her career with her poetry, because she was has been predominantly known as an essayist, as a journalist, as a poet, as a very talented writer, actually. And she used her poetry, her writing, as almost her weapon, her political tool to engage with this kind of discourse. Not only just the verbal conversations that were going on, but she actively took part in helping out at schools, at rehabilitation centres, all sorts of things like that. And that, combined with her poetry, just made her a force to be reckoned with, to be honest.
And that's interesting, the kind of marriage of poetry and politics, because that's something, of course, we see in Proctor too. I wonder if that was maybe kind of a bond between them, that they had these shared interests, and not just the kind of political interests, but the way in which they were able to use poetry to engage with politics.
No, absolutely. I think it was integral to their friendship. Not only their religious outlook on things, I think that they were united by that, absolutely, particularly in their later years, I would say. But I think one of the main things that really did tie their friendship together was their shared belief that their poetry could be used for good, or used so powerfully. Again, from a Bessie Parks perspective, almost all of her poetry has some kind of social commentary. Again, one that springs to mind really is, well, Summer Sketches. Summer Sketches is fantastic. It's like an epistolary verse letter where, well, there's 3 verse letters. It's centered on this group of women who go on like a girl's holiday, if you will, to the King's Head Inn in Surrey. And they spend their time between painting, writing, and discussing women's rights. And there's so many cryptic references that they make allusions to throughout this poem. Again, Summer Sketches is but an example, but you've got 2 artists. You've got her biographical works with In a Walled Garden, in which she makes a lot of references and tributes to Proctor herself. So it's not just the poetry and the relationship between Parks and Proctor and the poetry, but also what they were writing in terms of explicit political discourse.
We get that impression from Parks of the female community that really helped Proctor, her aunt in Italy, who she visits and who influences her in her conversion to Catholicism, her mother and the influence there. But I'm aware that in Parks's letters, in Proctor's letters, that female community wasn't that kind of utopian space all of the time, particularly in that group of women that set up the English Women's Journal. And I wonder if you can say a bit about the conflicts that were going on there between the women, between Parks, Proctor, and some of the other women that were involved in that process and really fighting for women's rights, but doing it in quite different ways.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Bessie was friends with many people, and many of the women whom she was friends with did have very differing opinions on where they think the conversation should be going, in what ways they should be tackling women's rights, and what priorities that they should have in addressing women's rights. And I think her friendship with Barbara Bodichon, who was very, very cynical of Orthodox religion. She distanced herself from every kind of denomination of faith that would be considered Orthodox. So she was about as radical as you can possibly get at this moment in time. Whereas Adelaide was different. You know, she was a very devout Catholic, and Parks' own conversion in the early 1860s, Proctor was very, very integral to that transition, to that, you know, to her period of transformation into being a Catholic. And there is a real crucial period in Bessie's life wherein she's almost like at war with herself. She describes it as having like a crisis of identity. She's like, I need something to hold on to. I need something to spiritually guide me. I need that support from somewhere, and I don't have it. And I think that was pushing her towards leaning onto a denomination of faith such as Catholicism. But the real driving force behind Bessie converting to Catholicism was Proctor, and the conversations that they would be having, and the support that Proctor actually gave Bessie when she was having this identity crisis. Proctor was very supportive of that, always offering an ear or a shoulder of support whenever Bessie needed it. And believe me, she really did at this moment in time. And this was all happening at the same time that Bessie was the chief editor of the English Woman's Journal, when she was in charge of what would actually feature in the journal and who she was going to contact to ask to provide or contribute any kind of work. And that did kind of, shall I say, provoke some kind of arguments and disagreements amongst the women. So the likes of Emily Davies, who was an Anglican woman, she, in one of her letters, accuses Parks of editorial bias. Emily Davies essentially wrote a piece that Parks thought was attacking Catholic sisterhoods. So Parks essentially said, I'm not publishing this. But her justification was essentially, why should I publish this if we have got such a wide net of readers, such a wide target audience of different faith? Why should I upset the apple cart? So all of these differing opinions of women's rights, that differed. And there were subtle differences. I mean, they all had the best intentions. They all had the same objective, but these objectives were slightly fraying and slightly differing, and it all had to do with their religious differences. And it was these religious differences that led to Parks going, you know what? I'm going to pull the plug on this. And she left the English Woman's Journal in 1862. And it was, again, it was those early 1860s where Parks and Proctor really did forge this strength of friendship that they had here. Whereas the English Woman's Journal did continue, and coincidentally, Emily Davies took on the position as chief editor.
And that's really interesting. So there was a kind of difference in prioritization of a concern about religious difference versus the question about women's rights or
Yeah. Again, like the Church of England's stance on women's rights, or the priority, like the role of the mother, for instance, and the need for her to acquire an education was very different to the likes of the Catholics. In many ways, Catholicism was considered as quite. Well, by many, it was considered as very regressive. So when Parks did initially write to Barbara Bodichon, hinting at, oh, I think I might be doing this, Bodichon was absolutely horrified because Bodichon thought, I think it's something like, God forbid you ever join Catholicism. God forbid, because you'll lose everything that you have worked on. So Bodichon was absolutely horrified, but also in many ways, Catholicism was considered as very progressive because of the fact that, it allowed women to establish these sisterhood-like communities, to be able to, to be an active part in like the rehabilitation of certain individuals, of certain women, and just be a part of the work of charity. And I think Parks really craved that. She craved that sense of community that although she did have artistically, creatively, and politically with her friends, she did struggle spiritually. And I think she needed that spiritual reckoning, that anchor or that weight to be able to pull her back down to earth, I think.
Yeah, I was struck at how positively she describes Proctor's sister, who becomes a Roman Catholic nun.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, like, just as the friendship that she had with Proctor, I think it's a very, very special one, that is also overdue some scholarly attention in particular, because they weren't just tied necessarily by religion, but again, it's just the solidarity, the sisterly support that they received from one another. And the correspondence suggests that Bessie was around their house all of the time. I mean, we know about Proctor's family life and that they were at the centre of all of the social gatherings, weren't they? She said something along the likes of, in a walled garden, everybody of any literary pretension seemed to flow in and out of their house. And then she lists certain individuals. She mentions Dickens and she mentions the Rossettis and the Barrett Brownings. And it was through the Proctors that Parks actually got to meet Barrett Browning in person, who was her absolute literary idol. So again, their friendship, although it is very interesting and very important in terms of the religion side of things, as the tie between their friendship, it was just purely just based on the fact that they were just great friends and they were just great sources of support for one another in every aspect of their life, which is really, really special.
I'm just thinking about the idea of the friendship between them and, the kind of love between them. I'm thinking about how in A Walled Garden, Brooks draws attention in particular to Proctor's poem, A Woman's Question, as a poem dealing with the human heart. And I know in that poem and then in A Woman's Answer, the idea of a woman's choice, not just in relation to romantic love, but also going beyond romance to other forms of love and care, for instance, friendship, is dealt with, which I find quite lovely. And in the second one, in A Woman's Answer, the speaker talks about her favorite books, holding her favorite books in special tender care. And she singles out Aurora Leigh in particular. So that's really interesting that you just mentioned Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And I kind of wonder to what extent we might see the reading of certain texts, for instance, maybe Aurora Leigh or other poetry and essays and things, as contributing to this feminist community or this community of female friendship.
Yeah, no, I mean, well, a lot of the women's poems do touch upon very similar themes of female friendship and female solidarity. And Aurora Leigh was a massive inspiration creatively to Parks, but she viewed it as a model, a working model of her own life. She also referred to Barrett Browning more as an inspiration rather than merely as just an artist. But I think it's really interesting the fact that Parks perceived her as this artistic, creative, I don't know, religious, like godlike figure. At least that's the impression that I get when I read her correspondence and she's talking about Barrett Browning.
It just aligns really well with how Barrett Browning saw herself as a sort of prophetic, poetic voice. So I was just thinking that's an interesting kind of reflection of that.
No, it does, absolutely. To answer your questions, I think that absolutely contributes to a feminist community or some kind of poetic or literary sisterhood that we have got here between some of these women.
Alex, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been such a rich conversation.
Hi, Lizzie. Hi, Amanda. And thanks for inviting me to take part in this. My name is Jim Mussell. I'm a professor of 19th century print cultures at the University of Leeds. And my interests really are in print culture, the kind of inky, messy stuff that the Victorians produced so much of over the course of the century. So books, of course, but newspapers, magazines, periodicals, broadsides, advertisements, pamphlets, posters, all of that stuff that they were so keen on and so prolific in producing.
Okay, great. When was it that you first encountered Adelaide Proctor and her poetry?
So I guess I always kind of knew of Adelaide Ann Proctor because she's a poet and I work on literature and a woman poet as well. And so she's part of a kind of a collection of names that you become familiar with if you work on Victorian literature. But it was only really working on the 19th century serials edition, a digital project that published 6 newspapers and periodicals way back in 2008, that I began to kind of start to notice all the AAPs that ran through the Englishwoman's Journal. And so she became part of a kind of cohort of people who very quickly linked with that journal.
Okay, that's great. And that's a fascinating approach to it. Jessie Bouchon says in her obituary to Proctor in the Englishwoman's Journal that most people come across Proctor just as the poet, and she wants to give a different approach by her as a writer for the Englishwoman's Journal. So that different approach to her as this journalist, this correspondent, this writer is something that we're really keen to revive in this podcast episode and think more about.
Yeah, and it's great to sort of read her in those different ways as well, because we were talking just briefly beforehand about how her kind of textual, her literary legacy persists. And some of those journalistic pieces only, I guess, survive in the Englishwoman's Journal, those other kinds of writing that she did. And reading her in the Englishwoman's Journal, you really do get a different representation of her than you would do if you were just reading the poetry.
Definitely a less melancholy one, more lively and engaged with social issues in lots of ways that we then can read back into her poetry.
I think that's right, and because the poetry is lyric poetry as well. It of course engages with selfhood and subjectivity, but it's very condensed. And when she's writing prose, it's so much more expansive. I know it's an obvious thing to say, but an important one nonetheless.
So the 19th century serials edition website, which you have been instrumental in producing, has done a lot to enable scholarship on 19th century periodicals. And in addition to the inclusion of the English Women's Journal, this feminist monthly publication that Proctor was involved in founding, the site includes content from various other very different publications. Could you explain a little bit how you decided on which publications and why you decided to include the English Women's Journal?
Yeah, sure. So the 19th century serials edition originated in an HRB grant back in those days. Put together by Laurel Brake, Isabel Armstrong, and Mark Turner. And what they wanted to do was to produce quite a small, condensed edition. Not small in terms of how it actually ended up. I think the original sense of what the project would involve was ambitious, but ambitious in a different way. They thought they would, by focusing on 6 different publications. Publications are the Monthly Repository, the Englishman's Journal, the Northern Star, Tomahawk, and a slice of the Publisher's Circular. By focusing on those 6 journals, they could ask questions about scholarly editing, whether it's possible to edit periodical content using approaches from textual criticism, to explore a bit about what was possible in the digital environment, and then to make those publications accessible. And with this interesting material coming from these very different but forward-thinking groups in the period, it was kind of envisaged there'd be lots of interesting textual stuff to engage with, lots of interesting content, as well as the diversity in format. What we found was we were undone by the inkiness of Victorian journalism, and it was much, much larger than we thought it was. So what was going to be a quite focused edition of 30,000 pages turned out to be about 120,000,
Wow.
just simply because these journals were much bigger than they appeared to be when you just look at page numbers.
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, a testament to the kind of extent of, publication growth in the 19th century.
Yeah, and the English Women's Journal sits quite interestingly in the context of NCSC. So as we were working on the different publications, we really liked the English Women's Journal, partly because it's really interesting to read, but it's also very, very consistent. So it's the short shortest of the 6 publications and the most consistent of the 6 publications in terms of format. And I think in terms of the context of our conversation, I think that's really important because the English Women's Journal's particular political bent sort of relies on a version of respectability, but also just kind of being there, coming out every month, providing a framework within which certain discussions can happen. And so its consistency, I think, is actually part of its political message, that it's both respectable, of course it's respectable coming from that group of women, middle-class women, as connected as they were, but also consistent, that it provides a framework within which sometimes difficult conversations can be had.
Yeah, it strikes me the repetition of the same pieces through the English Women's Journal, the notices for books, the passing events is in every issue, and the council as well.
Yeah, I mean, all serial publications kind of invoke each issue invokes the one that's going to come after it. And in a kind of way, by doing that, they also invoke the one that's come before it. So even if you look at the first issue of a periodical, you kind of imagine what the completely imaginary previous issue would be. So if you look at the first issue of the English Women's Journal, it kind of, you could imagine a -1, a -2, a -3, because with the appearance of the second and third, it kind of reiterates the presence of that serial form that lurks underneath each issue. So issues of periodicals don't just exist on their own, they exist in the context of this broader framework. And I think repetition has material effect as well. When you see things over and over again, you kind of expect them, they underscore the significance of certain things. And in English Women's Journal, there are those repeating departments, as we call them in NCSE language. So open counsel, the correspondence section, passing events, as you mentioned, and notices of books, which appear every time. And as soon as you've seen those twice, you then expect them to appear over and over again. And they do, and they reassure you. It's like no matter what happens in the world, there's a framework here waiting for it all to be fitted into. So there's kind of reassurance too about seriality. I think in that way, they're conservative in a good way, in that they kind of provide this reassuring framework that they can contain everything that happens. And that's what makes supplements and the other bits that go along with periodicals so interesting, because that's sort of when the framework breaks down and things squeeze out. What's notable, I think, about the English Women's Journal is that poetry always comes in the middle. It's always the third or fourth or fifth article. So it's right in the center. And the way they name their articles, they just do so, they just number them basically. So Open Council appears with the same title, but everything else gets whatever title it is. So the poetry is not labeled as poetry. Here's the poetry section. It exists as an article in its own right, equivalent to everything else, and it's right in the middle of the journal. So I think you can understand poetry too as a recurring and integral part of the English Women's Journal, and it is part of the conversation that the English Women's Journal represents too. It's not just some sort of literary extra or decoration or ornament. It's fully part of the journal.
I found that address to friends and the address to kind of familiar people through the journal quite striking, especially when we know that Proctor sat in the offices there and wrote to lots of the subscribers, and the subscribers are really buying into the journal. And I was thinking especially of the 2-part piece that Proctor published in the English Women's Journal, Adventures of Your Own Correspondence in Search of Solitude, where she recounts a visit to the Lake District with 2 companions where they take their reading. And it's quite meta thinking about the English Women's Journal, because they talk initially about opening up the packet that contains it and expecting to see if their pieces are in it and thinking about that content of the journal. And she wrote another piece about watchmakers in Christchurch. They've not been reprinted elsewhere.
I think they do, and those are 2 good pieces to contrast, aren't they? So the Adventures of Your Own Correspondence in Search of Solitude is this kind of lively, picaresque romp through northern England and the Lake District, and then the contribution, the piece about watchmakers in Christchurch is part of a series on employment for women. And so you got one. They're both journalistic. They're journalistic in different ways. One's kind of light-hearted. It's kind of literary reading. Proctor's own narrative voice is quite pronounced, but she also represents A quite firmly as well. The characters in there are quite well drawn, whereas the watchmaker's piece is a little more dispassionate. It's part of a series where different members of the English Women's Journal circle all write about different occupations. So Parks has a piece on printing and women, and it comes out just before they launched the Victoria Press. So those kind of journalistic pieces, I think, are important to show Proctor's range. The fact that she could do journalism, right? She can write in different formats and different ways just to suit her readers. I think 2 of those pieces are good because they represent the way the English Women's Journal does community in different ways too. It's because the Englishman's Journal is published by the Langham Place group. They kind of all know each other, and it can be a bit clubby and cliquey, I think. And yet there are efforts to involve other people outside. I mean, it was quite a low circulation journal, 100 or so regular subscribers, where it started out about 250 direct sales, gets up to about 1,000 once the National Association for the Promotion of Social Science gets established. Again, there's a link there between activism, social organizations, and print publications. And it's a kind of mutually supportive one, right? The journal can publish the proceedings of the society drives readers and subscribers to the journal. They reaffirm each other. So the Englishman's Journal kind of represents both personal relations, and they're complicated personal relations between these women, broader social configurations. And then it's also trying to write to an audience beyond that. And in the kind of the rocky relationship the Englishman's Journal has with some of the reviews that it gets, you sort of see that it's being noted, that there is this publication out there as part of the kind of constellation of 19th century prodigals. They have a public voice. They're speaking to each other and to a broader public beyond themselves as well. And then how they represent themselves within the journal is kind of interesting, right? Regular readers would know who BRP is or who AAP is. And then they would start to recognize the names and the people involved. So they would start to know these women from the initials and the articles that are being published.
Could one of you explain a little bit what the Langham Place group was for listeners who might not be familiar with that?
Okay, so the group of feminists that we talked a bit to Alex Round about, Barbara Bottishan and Bessie Parks and other females in the group that are feminist writers, activists, thinkers who gathered together in London to address issues of women in employment, women particularly in education and the rights of education for women. From that, Jim mentioned previously the Victoria Press. They initiated a press that was run by women and used female compositors.
For me, the significance of the Langham Place group, one of the ways in which it's significant is that it's a social group, that people knew each other, allowed them to collaborate and work together, but also provided physical premises. So there's a reading room there, so people could come and then launch things and like also activist startups could be shaped in the reading room. So it was a social space too, and it was a space that wasn't. It was its own node in a network alongside people's kind of friendships and visiting each other in people's houses. It shifted those social relations into a kind of more of a neutral space. They didn't belong to anybody, but belonged to the group. And so it allowed a kind of activism which would have been more difficult, I think, had they been using rented rooms somewhere or having to do it through domestic networks. Instead, it was a place that was theirs, and they could meet one another, work with one another, and start things off from there. And the Englishman's Journal is a kind of textualized version of that space, I think. So the Englishman's Journal's wrappers, for instance, had notices about the employment agency for women, which Proctor was not just involved with, but was one of the kind of leaders in. So the journal provided advertisements for the employment agency that was then run out of Langham Place. So the things were all connected like that. Print is a kind of representation of a social space, but also an extension of it, because of course print can move in a way that space can't. The Victoria Press, though, it was really significant, and as a kind of manifestation and a realization of some of the goals of the journal. So in the employment agency, they set up a number of different modes. And the Englishman's Journal's first article complains that only teaching is a viable profession for middle class women, and there are too many teachers. So it goes on then to discuss their poor conditions and things like that, and then stresses the importance of other avenues for work for particularly middle-class women. In the case of this instance, the Victoria Press's compositors were a lot more diverse than that. They printed the Englishman's Journal from 1860 to 63, 64. They published the Law magazine. They published the Transactions for the National Association for the Promotion of Social Science. So it provided employment, and it produced print. It achieved all the goals that the group set out for it.
Do we know much about the readership? I know probably it would have tended towards people who were sympathetic with the cause, but you also mentioned, Jim, that there were some less favorable responses to some of the publications. But do we know a lot about who was reading it?
That's interesting. I don't know much myself. I mean, you can kind of, given the numbers involved, It's kind of respectable. The Englishman's Journal, it's easy to think about it. It lasts for 6 years, and it's easy to think, oh, that's not very long. But that's
Mm.
6 years of regular monthly
Yeah.
publication
Yeah.
in a pretty turbulent time in the
Yes.
19th century
Yeah.
in terms of print and print culture. I think its readers were people who are interested in it, and there's lots of examples of people who became involved in the Englishman's Journal, the Langham Place Group's various activities because they found the journal and
Okay.
found their way to London and to the group
Mm.
through that. But I'd love to know more about the readers. I don't know, Lizzie, do you know anything about the readers?
I think the best clue is probably the open council section in the English Women's Journal itself, because that contains letters from people responding to previous issues, to previous conversations that have come up. I think lots of the pieces, as I said, are quite meta as well, referring to the English Women's Journal, thinking about that as a publication and the readers. And I wonder, I haven't looked specifically for that, but I wonder about the records of it as well. Quite a lot are in Girton College, and Proctor was
Hmm.
there writing to the subscribers. So subscriber
Mm.
lists could tell you
Yeah.
more about those. And
Oh,
as
yeah.
Yeah.
as Marianne Remortal, the Victorian periodicals expert at the University of Ghent, has done, is look at census records to find more about some unknown workers and others. So that would be one way of going about thinking,
Mhm.
who were these subscribers that were on subscriber lists? So might tell you more if
Mm.
someone was going to put that effort into searching for who
Yeah.
they were, what their
PhD
status was
topic.
at different
Yeah.
times. I'm not sure where these
Yeah.
are for this journal, but that could be a possibility.
Be a
Yeah.
great
Uh,
project, wouldn't it? I mean, it reminds me
mm.
that, with the Englishman's Journal, Miranda Marachini's excellent digital project tracing all the contributors to the journal. So I've kind of done the production side. So it'd be really nice to complement that with some more work on readership for the journal.
Thank you so much, Jim, for joining us today on the
Yeah. Thank you.
podcast.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's been great to spend some time again with the Englishman's Journal and look back upon it. I mean, it's a fantastic journal, and it's always well worth the read.
Thanks for listening today. In our next episode, we'll be thinking about Proctor's charity work, her activism, and her fundraising. And we'll be speaking to Maria O'Donoghue from the Providence Row charity and Lisa Scholl, who's written extensively on Proctor and 19th century women writers in relation to hunger and religion. Here's just a taster of Maria telling the story of Providence Row.
We have an unbelievable story to tell. And I think when you paint a narrative, of which indeed Proctor has done, it's how you use your words and how you portray. So I've always been one to draw on our history, where we come from, where we find ourselves in modern day, but also ensuring that you appeal to the sensibilities of the individual that you're speaking to. It's bringing out the compassion in somebody to be able to contribute to somebody less fortunate.
And it's that compassion that we discussed with Lisa as we hear what drew her to scholarship on Proctor and look at some of Proctor's poetry with her.
I think too there is a quality in her poetry in the way that she's able to be didactic and explicit, but at the same time she uses the rigor and boundaries of poetry to prevent a psychological resistance to the objection that she is showing. So I think really it's that personal human experience that she brings, giving voice and vision to poverty in a way that is nuanced rather than caricatured.
Thanks for listening today, and do tune in to hear the next conversation.